Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone Season 5, Episode 1. It is called In Praise of Pip. So, spoilers for the episode. We're back to the 25-minute without ads episodes, which felt like a breeze to get through after Season 4's, full hour-long stories. But hey, it felt like a nice return to the Twilight Zone that we get into to begin with. I will say this is only just an okay episode, though. All things considered, I think the performance of the lead actor, Jack Klugman, who plays this father of this, young man who's off in Vietnam, is a very early contemporary at the time Vietnam story, and he's waiting to hear if his son's okay, and then get some bad news that his son is probably going to die. The opening scene of the episode establishes that he's got some serious wounds, and the doctor thinks that his chances aren't great. They're going to try and save him, obviously, but he doesn't have great odds. And the episode is mostly about the father, played by Klugman, who is a bit of a con man and a gambler and a drunk, and him kind of reminiscing about his son, particularly in the back half, where we get kind of a walking into the past style story that we've had many times before in Twilight Zone, where he sees his son as a 10-year-old boy, played by Bill Mummy, I'm not sure how you say his name, but from the original Lost in Space and then later Babylon 5, he's playing the kid version, and it's like he's going around the amusement park, reminiscing and having this one last great night with his son. And this hour that he gets with the kid version of his son happens to be the hour that we know that the current adult version of his son has to maybe live or not. The doctors perform surgery and say, well, if he can make it through an hour, he'll probably make it forever. Well, not forever, but he'll die of old age eventually. But he has to get through this rough first little patch, and if his body can do that, then he'll survive. So the hour that Jack Klugman spends with the 10-year-old version kind of syncs up with that. At least that's how it felt to me in the episode. So, yeah, the big thing is the performances. Jack Klugman, I think the scene where he gets the phone call and find out that his son is probably going to die. Obviously, it turns out he doesn't, and we'll get into the ending in a bit. But I think his performance, his reaction there, is probably my favorite moment of the entire episode. And I think the way that even his con man kind of bookie criminal boss even kind of gets quiet and is very sympathetic in the moment, sells the severity of what's happening. It sells that despite the fact that this is a fairly bunch of nefarious characters, even they're sort of treating them with a little bit of kindness and sympathy in the moment. Obviously it doesn't last very long when Klugman's character decides to kind of rebel and sort of change his ways because of what's happening to his son, but I think that performance for me was the most I ever felt from the episode. I think the episode has just a few problems that hold it back. A big thing is that this revelation comes quite late in the first half, right? So we're doing a 25-minute episode. We've got two 10-11-minute segments, basically. Once you take out the opening and the closing credits and the next time on and all that stuff, it's quite late in the first half when this phone call happens. And before that phone call, we set up the son in Vietnam. We get a quick scene of that, which was fine. And then we get a whole scene introducing Klugman's character where he's at his small apartment, and it establishes that he's a drunk, which is important, and establishes the type of person that he is. I did feel like it set up some stuff that it felt like it didn't really do as much with that I thought it was going to. It sets up this younger character who comes in, this young man who's probably about his son's age, who's also trying to be a gambler and whatever. And it kind of felt like, oh, this is going to be someone that he can sort of be a father figure to, perhaps, in the second half of the story. Maybe if he couldn't be the best father he could to his son, maybe he can make up for it with this guy. And that's not where the episode goes at all. Enough to the point where it kind of felt like we spent maybe just a little bit too much time. Well, that's not even that fair. It's not that much time, but just, it felt like it introduced this character as a major player. And then once the phone call happens and there's a quick little bit of action when he gets into a fight with the bookie and the henchman, and he tells this young guy to run off with the money so he doesn't have to pay his debts. that's him. He's gone. He's gone from the episode, and he never comes back. At that point, it turns into a walking distance style episode with Jack Klugman spending the night with his son before one of them's going to die, because he's in the fight that he has with the bookie, he gets a gunshot wound to the stomach. So this kind of feels like it's a dying wish kind of thing. It's all about him bonding with his son and trying to like apologize for the fact that he was a drunk, that he was always conning people, and he wasn't always there as much as he could have been, and he has all these regrets. I mean, that's what the episode's really about. It's about the regret of what he was to his son, and he wished he'd been a better father, and that's what the episode's getting at. And that's all fine stuff, but when I tell you the second half of the episode kind of shifts into familiar territory for Twilight Zone, it notably kind of points out how confined it feels in only that second half, when previous episodes that have done this story will get them into their Twilight Zone style plot a lot quicker. It'll get them into it. And I actually do appreciate that doing a little bit of time building up to the phone call, makes you care about him or gives you some context for the character before it happens. But I do almost think that the entire first scene where he's in his apartment and he talks to his landlady a little bit, and then he talks to the young guy, I feel like all of that could have probably been cut, because I think you can get across everything in the scene that you have to get across about who this guy is in the scene with the bookie, in the scene where he goes and pays off his debt, and then the young guy comes in, and then the phone call happens, and it all plays out there. I feel like that scene on its own kind of established enough of who he was. Maybe slot in a few of the things that were in the other scene into that scene, and I think it would have been much more efficient. Because as it is, when the episode ends for the ad break and it does its cliffhanger, the cliffhanger is just him, like the gunshot wound's already happened, and he's just kind of stumbling into the amusement park. It ends in kind of a quiet note, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing. Like, I'm not saying every cliffhanger for the ad break has to be a big, dun 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 kind of moment. Like, it doesn't. But I think it kind of felt like it didn't have as much of a driving force as far as a plot goes. It felt like, oh, it's just time to go to the ad break. Instead of we're at a big pivotal moment where things are going to change for the character. While I think the performance between Klugman and the kid is solid, and they have chemistry when they're going around doing the various amusement park stuff, playing the games, and it's actually closed right now. All the fact that they're doing anything here is all kind of Twilight Zone-y. Like, all of a sudden everything's operating despite the fact that it's closed for the night. That's just, Twilight Zone stuff. But it kind of just all happens in a montage until you get to the next pivotal scene where you can actually, monologue a bit more. And that's the scene when they get to a hall of mirrors and the kid saying, young Pip saying, Dad, I'm dying. I need to go. Like, time's up. Like, I'm gone. And we get this big dramatic scene in the Hall of Mirrors where Jack Klugman is monologuing his heart out about being a better father and apologizing for not being there and all these other things. And obviously the fact that it's in a Hall of Mirrors, it's him reflecting on his life and reflecting on his time as a father. It's pretty simple symbolism. It's a pretty good looking scene though, and it does kind of make it stick out in my head a little bit compared to the rest of the episode. I think the starkness of the phone call where he's just sort of looking out the window and we just sort of stay in his face, like, I think I preferred that a little bit, but I appreciate what it was doing here, and I appreciate that it, like when he goes to like run after him and he runs into a mirror and it smashes and he comes sort of crumbling back down to reality. I think that is effective on its own for what it is, and it's one of the highlights of the episode. But I think the episode as a whole just lacks much of a drive. It lacks that strong pull where the character's in a predicament and they're trying to solve it in some way. And I get that not every story kind of lends itself to that, but it kind of felt like if we'd started the night with the sun a little bit earlier and we sort of like were able to remind the audience as it was going on that our main character is actually kind of slowly dying and that the sun might also slowly be dying, afar, but still dying. I think you could have ramped up this sort of sadness of it counting down to maybe this really tragic, sad ending where both of them are going to die. And maybe that would have hit harder just a little bit. The episode ends with Klugman begging God to take his life instead of his son's. And, you know, the way the episode presents it, it maybe worked because Klugman kneels over and dies, and we get a scene with adult Pip, you know, young man Pip coming back from the military and going around the carnival with a walking stick, reminiscing about his father a little bit. And it's a nice enough scene. I actually had a cynical read on this a little bit. Is that, well, it's not super cynical. So the idea that Klugman is probably dying anyway, you know, he's making this bargain with God. He's saying, hey, take me instead of my son. I beg you. You know, he deserves to live. This is the last thing I can do for him. I think I read that if you read this in a more sort of down-to-earth way, you can read this as more of a psychological thing where he's not actually making a deal with God. His son doesn't survive because he makes this, you know, heroic sacrifice. His son lived because his son was going to live, and Klugman was always going to die here because he was dying of a gunshot wound. But psychologically for him, he's doing this, he's saying this with his final words because he wants to feel like he is doing something for his son at the very end. I don't want to say he's tricking himself per se, but this idea that at least if he feels as he's dying that his death is accomplishing something and giving his son like the one final thing for him that he wishes he could have done more for him throughout his life. I kind of read it more of a psychological thing where he's not actually making a deal or achieving anything with this. He's just going out on terms where he feels like he's accomplishing something with his dying breath, effectively. And it just so happens that his son does live. Because the Twilight Zone, I think you're meant to read it as, so he did kind of save his son's life here. Me, I'm kind of reading it more as, no, what was going to happen happened regardless, but he just, you know, he needed to feel this, that he'd accomplished something right at the very end. He wanted to save his son's life, and, you know, obviously he doesn't know that he's succeeded or not, but he's certainly hoping he does as he falls to the floor. Yeah, I think it maybe takes a little bit too much time to get to its main Twilight Zone gimmick, and then once it does, it mostly is just kind of a montage and then gets to the final monologue. And I think if we'd got the phone call, because the phone call scene is great, you start that off a little bit earlier, you go straight into that maybe, and just establish the character in that scene along with the phone call, and we can maybe do a little bit more with him actually talking to his young son, and maybe explore a little bit more about, so I guess some more specifics. You know, it's all very kind of general. I was a drunk. I wasn't there because I was doing my illegal job. Maybe a specific memory, something for him to really latch onto and say, oh, this particular night where I did this and it messed up your birthday party, or it messed up that year of your life, or something. I don't know. Anything. Just something a bit more concrete that they could discuss and come to some sort of resolution for, or at the very least not a resolution, but something that makes Klugman's character Max, something that makes him maybe realize that he wants to make up for things, as opposed to just, you know, as soon as he gets the phone call, he just feels instant this regret. Maybe if he felt like a lot of feelings, but they didn't really form into like just straight up what he wants to do with them until he was reminded or something, you know, like some kind of like proper inciting memory when he's going around with the little version of his son that would inspire the fact I have to make up for this. Is, you know, whereas he's already kind of at that point immediately, so there's not really much of a, you know, a progression from there until the end. You know, the character's desires or needs don't really change after that point in the episode. So I think that would have also heightened it and made it a better overall story. As it is, I think it's obviously got a sweet kind of idea. It's very contemporary for its time. This idea of people being worried of their sons dying in Vietnam was a very new thing in 1963, I'm willing to bet. I said last time I didn't even realize the US was in Vietnam this early. I didn't think it happened for another couple of years. So I get that at the time it was probably a very hard-hitting story because it was tapping into something that was just starting to go on around the time period. It, you know, obviously it was a little bit before because they had to make the episode, but this must have been very fresh as far as the topic goes at the time. You know, not the idea of war in general, obviously, but specifically the Vietnam War. So I think I can see kind of the appeal of them doing this episode. But I think as a whole, it's lacking enough of an actual concrete story to really make me like it. But Klugman's performance is very strong, and he kind of gives some moments of the episode enough to make it kind of worth checking out. but it's not one that I'd be recommending that highly or one that I'd be rushing to on a rewatch. That's my thoughts in praise of Pip. It's just okay for all the reasons that I've outlined. Next time on the Twilight Zone, we have an episode called Steel. We got Lee Marvin in this one. Rod was quite proud to tell us that at the end of the episode. But here's the description on IMDb. In 1974, boxing has been outlawed. I paused there for a second because I'm like, oh yeah, 1974 is the future. It doesn't feel like that to us, but keep in mind that's a decade later after this episode. In 1974, boxing has been outlawed and is performed by mechanical robots. With his next and possibly last fight approaching and his robot in need of a repair, he resorts to one last desperate gamble. Holy crap, they're doing real steel. The Hugh Jackman movie with the kid and like the Rock'em Sock'em robots. We're doing that, but with Twilight Zone. All right, okay. I'm intrigued by the premise. So that's Steel. And obviously I say that, I'm sure the title Real Steel for that movie was maybe inspired by this episode's title. It wouldn't surprise me. You know, so many modern writers are influenced by Twilight Zone, so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so that's next time. We'll see how that episode is, but let me know what you thought of In Praise of Pip in the comments. Like, subscribe, all the usual things. Helps out a lot if you do. More people will find the channel and the reviews, so it really does help out. And of course, if you want to support as much as you can go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and do so over there for a little bit of money every month and get some bonuses for your trouble, including monthly reviews of Columbo. The second one just went up recently. So if you want to hear me talk about Columbo on a monthly basis, you get that as a bonus for being a patron or a YouTube member. But that is me, so thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.